10 tips for raiding in Lord of the Rings Online. Typically, raiding consists of getting in with a big group of players in the game and pretty much just going into a dungeon or a massive instance where you get to slay some really difficult mobs or enemies. A lot of endgame content focuses around getting into raids in the later game, but I would just mention that raids are probably the best bet and the best place to go for the best gear in all of LOTRO. Now, I'm someone who hasn't really raided much in this game. I'm actually a very casual player. I don't really like to go in like these more instance teamworky type of situations. I'm a casual solo. I'm still getting into raiding, so these are just some general tips that I would give anyone who is either considering raiding or is currently raiding. Tip number 1, this is something you should do before you even go into a raid. Make sure you have hope tokens or some sort of hope buff. So one of the things that most of the mobs will throw at you is this thing called dread, which will definitely decrease your morale. It'll make your character more frightened, basically. So a lot of the stats even for them can definitely decrease with dread, and overall it's just a terrible thing to have on your character, a big debuff. But you can counteract it with some hope. So if you pop a hope token or you have a hope buff, that'll actually help you counteract the dread, which can help you tremendously when facing some of the toughest mobs and bosses. The easiest way to get hope tokens is by having a jeweler or a tinker craft them for you, and they can do that pretty early on from their crafting levels. You can also get hope tokens from some loot boxes or even from some random mob drops when you're out in the open world, but like that's very, very rare. And of course there are some barters in the game as well, but that's also really hard to find, and really the best way is just to have someone craft it for you. But if you are a VIP, there is a hope buff perk that is temporary, so you can always use your destiny points for that, which I feel like most people forget. I definitely do, but don't forget about that option as well. Tip number 2, before you go into big fights, make sure you're eating food. So pretty much make sure you have food before you get into the raid. And I know what you're thinking, why do I need food that bad in LOTRO? Well, food actually helps with a lot of like your character stats and can help you counteract some potential like debuffs that could apply to your character going forward into battle. Make sure you're eating before you're going against some of the bigger bosses in the raid, because the food does have a duration. You can typically find some sort of food that can help boost up your character stats, either by having someone who's a cook craft it up for you. You preferably would also need to coordinate with a farmer for that too. You can also find some food in the auction hall. It's normally not that expensive, and sometimes even from in-game quests they offer some food as well. All of those together, you should probably have a good idea of where to get some food at, but make sure you are eating food before prepping for bigger difficult boss fights. Tip number 3, get used to dying. It's just like Elden Ring, you're gonna die. Okay, that seemed really dark, but trust me, it's pretty much just realizing you are going to fall in battle. It's inevitable. It happens to all of us. You will fall in battle. Sometimes it's just a matter of everybody getting the timing and pacing right when you're in this big group with players. It's a lot of communicating and just getting timing down correctly. And if you don't get it down the first time, which happens often, you're probably going to result in your character falling in the battle. But it happens. Don't be upset about it. It just is what it is. But that also leads up to another point of just make sure you grab your VIP perks before you get into the raid if you are a VIP, so you don't have to keep paying a repair bill. And if you are someone who is not VIP, make sure you stock up on a lot of silver, because your gear will be not that durable. Tip number 4, make sure you have your gear and virtues maxed out to as far as you can go. Virtue should be capped the frick up. I don't care what you say, they should be capped no matter what, but especially in raiding, it should almost be like a necessity. Either way though, you should have your virtues capped because it just helps with your character stats. It can help boost up your morale, but of course with gear, that also goes into effect as well. The hard part though is that the best gear in LOTRO, from what I've heard, is just from raids, so how can you go into raids with the best gear if you can only get it from doing the raid? I know, right? Doesn't make much sense. But there are other ways that you can get better gear. I would definitely recommend that you check out some other instances. Instances sometimes have really good gear drops. I get a lot of my gear personally from just questing, but I would honestly tell you that you should have a character that also can craft up some armor for you, because that's probably your best bet, especially if you're not comfortable going through with instances at the moment. Just get crafted gear made. It does really help and make a difference. There are other barters I would recommend recommend you check out. There's a frick ton all over the place, but just make sure you're keeping an eye on some rep barters, also on your crafted gear, and then also between instances. Just keep an eye out between all three of those and make sure that you're constantly checking to see if you can get upgraded gear. Speaking of virtues, one thing that's super important to look at under that category are also your class trait trees. Make sure you're using all of your points, but also the next tip is to make sure you have both loadouts already ready to go. And what I mean by that is that there's a page 1 and 2 for the class trait trees. If you actually fill those out and utilize those, they should be used to essentially have you switch roles in your class. So kind of depending on your class, you could have different specs to go through. Like you could be strictly healing as a rune keeper, or you could be strictly damage as a rune keeper. But make sure your class loadouts are ready to go in the class trait trees. So if you want a DPS rune keeper, make that page 1, fill it all out like that. And if you really want a healing rune keeper, which I would recommend you have a healing rune keeper in raiding, then have a page 2. But depending on the raid, and sometimes depending on what other people have joined or what they can bring to the table, sometimes you might want to go in just strict DPS, but they might really need more tanks. So you have to be ready to prepare to switch over even before some certain battles, because it just depends on what the skill set is for your group, but also the mobs themselves and the bosses. Another tip I have for you, which I haven't really heard many people say, and it might not be the best tip, and I'll be honest by saying it, but I find that it's actually a lot better to go to the actual raid locations instead of just going through the instance finder. At least when it comes down to like doing some weekly quests for raids, I found like with doing the rift that there was a camp up above the rift itself which offered some weeklies that I could do, but also there were vendors there that allowed me to trade some of the bartering items that I got from that raid. So I found that it was actually just way easier for everybody to kind of meet prior to the raid, near the raid location. But I would also just check around, make sure that there's not any like weekly quests or any potential like dailies or something that you might be missing, some additional quests that you can't get in from the raid, from the instance finder anyway, and you can only get it from being outside in the world of Middle-earth. The next tip I have are for people who are newer to raiding and want to start organizing. As an organizer of a raid, make sure you have all your essential roles that you need for a raid. What I mean by that is that every raid should have the essential for your DPS, your support, your heals, and of course your tanks. You will need all of these roles at some point, and they will be very beneficial depending on mobs, but they should just be like a general thing that you go for all the time. It seems kind of crazy to say this, I know, because it is kind of like a common thing that you should always go for, but I just really want to specify that for anyone who hasn't even done raiding at all. Just make sure you're getting your 4 essential roles together. Support is probably going to be the harder one to find, and I've also found that tanks are kind of hard to come around, but that's just from my personal experience. Another tip I have, and this is mostly for like the raid leaders, but make sure that you're utilizing your raid markings and also your assist windows, because these are essentially ways to communicate with your group what mobs you want to attack and how it all works. So the raid assist window is typically on the side of your screen where it'll show you what one person is currently targeting. So like if your raid leader, for example, is targeting like the main boss and they're like, everybody just slay this dude, you know? For this example, the raid assist window will show your leader, but it'll also show you whatever they are currently targeting. And then for raid markers, what is typical is that people will put symbols above mobs or even some of their fellow group members' heads to show or represent like what they are. So obviously for healers, typically they'll have like, I don't know, say like a sun over their head. And then for whatever mob you really want to focus on and communicate to your group, sometimes they'll put skulls over them, but that's up for your leaders to decide and whoever the leader assistant is. Tip number 9 is to check LOTRO wiki. And what I mean by that is not really to go through and tell you like what the tricks are for slaying certain mobs or bosses. It's really just to not be frustrated by puzzles. when you go into raids, there will be some puzzles or some mechanics that will come into play that you either have to time just right, or you have to make sure that all of your group members have some sort of like lever or button to hit, and pretty much you just have to be very well coordinated. But I'm not gonna lie, sometimes it's really difficult to figure out what like the puzzle is, and I would just recommend that you consult LOTRO Wiki for that, so then that way you can kind of just save yourself some hassle. I know it might take away from like learning the experience and getting through it, but I'm not gonna lie to you guys, some of these puzzles are just so dang difficult that without any sort of guide, I would never be able to complete any raid because they're just not that self-explanatory, at least for me. And then of course, the last tip I have for you is that if you get stuck on a part and your group just cannot get through it, don't be afraid to consult world chat or ask for help in world chat. That's what we had to do for our raid night. We just pretty much couldn't get like all of our DPS coordinated at the right time really, and we were just getting really discouraged. So we reached out to world chat and we got a few people to join us and slayed that final boss with no problems, guys. It was very good. I know world chat can kind of feel like this more negative thing, but there are a lot of great people who are just really willing to help you with anything in LOTRO if you need it. Sometimes you just have to take the first step though and ask for help, which I'm terrible at, so be better than me. But that is all. I hope that those tips help you throughout your raiding journey in LOTRO. And of course, if you want more LOTRO videos, just make sure that you check out my guides playlist up above, and I'll also link it down below. But until then, you better stay weird, you weird weirdos.